All right, last week we saw really Paul kind of wrapping up this idea that has occupied a lot of the first 3 chapters, which is just a bit of a rehearsal of their relationship in the past, Paul and the church in Thessalonica. I mean, how he had lived among them, what his feelings towards them were, especially in chapter 3. He's really trying to get them to understand the point that he had not abandoned them, and to really just solidify in their minds his concern for them and his care. So much so that he had been willing to kind of do without Timothy, who is, as we know, both from this book as well as other places in the New Testament, Timothy was in many ways indispensable to Paul. He was so valuable to him because of his faith, because of their like minds, and his goodness, his strength. Paul really relied upon Timothy a lot, but he said he was willing to do without that so that he could send Timothy to the church there to strengthen them, to continue encouraging them in the way that they were going, but also to get some news to bring back to Paul so that he would know how they were doing. So Paul was willing to do that on their behalf. He's praying constantly for them. As we mentioned last week, maybe the content of those prayers is instructive to us. It is very much spiritually oriented. His primary concern is their spiritual well-being. He's concerned about their daily lives and just how they're doing the way we ask each other, how are you doing? But he really wants to be sure that they are holy, that their conduct is good, that they're growing in love, that they have faith, their belief is strong, all of these sorts of things. That's his primary concern. But he's praying constantly for them. Well, now in chapter 4, he's going to make a kind of abrupt change of topic and begin discussing their daily conduct. Now, I'll mention here, and I know I've talked about this before. Maybe I'm a broken record to some of you, but in my estimation, I think maybe sometimes we overemphasize or make too much of the way Paul kind of tends to divide his letters, or the way they might split into these kind of opening doctrinal section and then the practical section that follows. And there is a kind of a clear pattern that you can see in a lot of his writing, where the first half, roughly, might be devoted more to these kind of theological concerns, the nature of God, the nature of our salvation, how that comes about. And then in the latter half, you turn to things that are more everyday. So here's how you live. Here's what you're supposed to do with this person. Here's your conduct as a husband and as a wife and as a parent and a worker, all these sorts of things, that kind of practical exhortation. A lot of, again, I think maybe a lot of that difference is overblown. Those two things are just so related to each other. They can't be separated from each other. All doctrinal or theological teaching is ultimately practical. It ultimately ends up in a behavior that is a certain behavior because of your understanding of God or the nature of salvation, or whatever the case might be, whatever doctrinal concern is in mind, that ultimately leads to a specific behavior. And all doctrinal teaching has to rest upon and ultimately is grounded back in, and we'll even see in this 4th chapter, it all springs from an understanding of who God is. It all comes from the nature of those bigger kinds of questions. So one is foolishness without the other. They just bleed into each other so much. I think when we find Paul starting to look at these more practical, everyday, ethical concerns, he's not just leaving theology behind. He's not leaving the bigger questions behind. They're all just building upon and supporting one another. But that being said, as I mentioned, there is a clear maybe shift of emphasis that you can observe sometimes, and chapter 4 is one of those, where we're getting more towards how does this impact your daily life? What is all of that understanding of who God is and what his gospel is and how you received it? What's that going to lead to? And maybe we're getting the impression as we go through chapters 4 and 5 that he is responding either to some specific questions that they might have had in Thessalonica, or some issues that Timothy might have observed and is going to have related back to Paul. Remember, this is coming probably fresh on the heels of Timothy having visited them and now coming back to Paul with news of how they were faring. So maybe they had some issues that they wanted further instruction on, some questions that were bothering them, or again, maybe not even things that they had voiced, but that Timothy had seen and was now able to bring back to Paul and say, look, they could use some instruction on X, Y, Z. But you'll find, like in verse 9, for instance, chapter 4, verse 9, chapter 5, verse 1, and this is similar to what you'll find in Paul's letter to Corinth, where you have him saying, but concerning this, or on the matter of so-and-so, which is at the time a common way of writing an answer to someone's queries. It's a common way of saying, all right, you raised this issue of brotherly love, or the times and the seasons of the Lord's return, as it will be in chapter 5. Here's my answer to that. You guys wanted information, so here it is. And so maybe we get the impression of Paul now able to kind of tackle some of their pressing needs and some of the concerns that they would have. And that's what we'll find chapter 4 beginning on this sort of look at what their conduct is like. Brother Garrett? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No matter what personality is behind it, I guess it's truth. That's the guarantee behind that inspiration, that it is objective truth as made known by God Himself, truth Himself. So, yeah, always important to remember. All right, let's begin by reading. I think we'll just approach these first 8 verses to begin with. This general section, I think, would really encompass the whole chapter. I think all of chapter 4 sort of stands as one united unit. I don't think we'll finish all of it this morning. So I want to start with the first 8 verses. Let's read them together. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. Finally then, brethren, we urge and exhort in the Lord Jesus that you should abound more and more, just as you receive from us, how you ought to walk and to please God. For you know what commandments we gave you through the Lord Jesus. For this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you should abstain from sexual immorality, that each of you should know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor, not in passion of lust, like the Gentiles who do not know God, that no one should take advantage of and defraud his brother in this matter, because the Lord is the avenger of all such, as we also forewarned you and testified. For God did not call us to uncleanness, but in holiness. Therefore he who rejects this does not reject man, but God, who has also given us his Holy Spirit. Now we're going to find within this a couple of things that are maybe themes for this letter as a whole, or really all of Paul's communication to Thessalonica as a whole, almost. The second letter is very similar in some respects. But one is the idea, and we've looked at this a couple of times before, there in chapter 4 and verse 1, and you'll find it again down in verse 10, the idea of increasing more and more, of continuing to abound. I just always find this a very important idea for us, especially for us who are Christians, or maybe have been Christians for a long time, that all instruction or encouragement or exhortation or rebuke or whatever it might be, that is not always simply for, you're doing it wrong, here's the right way to do it. There's some big problem I need to fix, so you need instruction. These people were in need of instruction, and Paul can tell them about some things that they were lacking in, and that's why he had sent Timothy in the first place, because there were things that needed to be shored up. But that does not always come to when you're doing wrong, when you are mistaken, when you need to be corrected. Sometimes it is simply this. You're doing pretty well already, or you've started out on the right foot. You just need to keep doing that. You need to increase in it. You need to excel. You need to continue adding on. And this is an idea we find numerous times in the letters to Thessalonica, that they would increase and abound and excel more and more. You just see that phrase coming up several times. This is an encouragement to all of us who might be doing pretty well already. Keep doing well. Do better. Don't grow complacent. Don't think that you have arrived. Just continue doing that which is right. Now, the other thing I want to focus on for a moment is there at the end of verse 1. Paul is ultimately telling them, all right, what do we need to abound in more and more? What is it that we're looking to do? Well, how you ought to walk, how you ought to live, and to please God. This is ultimately his admonition to them. That's in the broadest sense possible what the rest of the book is going to be about. Here's how you please God. Now, why is that? I don't really know how to ask the question, but what's the importance in, or what's the value in, looking at our lives as Christians, our lives of service to God, as ones that are meant to be pleasing to God? What are the implications of that? Why is that important? What might we gain from having that view of our lives? That what I'm doing, I'm trying to be pleasing to God. Yeah, Linda. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, we read it, I think, at least twice, just there, even in those first 8 verses. Linda mentions the idea of sanctification, being set apart, being holy. All right, I like what she's mentioned here, that being pleasing to God is very contrary to what the world does, and if we're not careful, to what many of us might do or have as our goal in life. We're trying to please other people. We're trying to please ourselves. We have our mind on worldly things, whereas this is immediately calling us to a focus and to a goal that is far beyond that I'm not trying to just succeed financially. I'm not just trying to make sure that I'm happy all the time and that, things are comfortable and easy for me. I'm not trying to just enjoy myself in life. I'm not trying to just make other people like me and have a good reputation, or whatever the motivation might be for so many in the world. Instead, here is the ultimate imperative, the thing that you have to have foremost in your mind if you're a Christian, that what I'm trying to do is to be pleasing to God. And if none of that other stuff happens, too bad. Maybe I'm not happy or successful or well-liked by my peers or whatever it might be. If I'm pleasing to God, that is enough, and that is what I ultimately want. Steve? Okay, in what way are we pleasing to God? Well, we're going to see it from what unfolds in chapter 4. A lot of it is involved in that kind of practical nature. You love him if you want to be pleasing to him. There are ways that is demonstrated. There are ways that one would show to himself as well as to God. And that is through an obedience to his will. That's through an adherence to his word. Eva? Yeah. 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 And that's important to look at. That is the best example we have anywhere of this. And Jesus himself would claim this on a few occasions as his motive behind everything that he's doing. I always do those things that please my Father, is what he says directly. That's what he's doing at any point in his life. What is pleasing to the Father, what is pleasing to God, what he views with respect and what he views with pleasure. And so if that was good enough for Christ, so to speak, then it's definitely good enough for me. And that's the example that we should be taking our cue from. Others? David, did you? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. through a life that is geared towards doing this, pleasing him. Other ideas there? Yeah, Linda. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is, I guess, part of that calling. If that is our calling to please God, it has to, by necessity, by its nature, it has to take precedence over everything else. And there can't be other challengers to that throne. There can't be other things that would sway us from that or impede us in that goal and that mission to be pleasing to God. It has to take precedence over everything else in our lives. It's radical. It's something that is, it requires our all. It requires complete commitment to that concept or to that goal that we're trying to please God. I would mention a couple of other things about this idea or this challenge to please God. One is, although we mentioned, rightly so, there's a way this happens. God is pleased and he views us as loving him when we keep his commandments. But through viewing things this way, that what am I trying to do overall? I'm trying to please God. If that's our beginning point and where we're taking our directions from, I think that goes a long way towards defeating the trap of simple commandment keeping and the kind of things that trip the Pharisees up so often of, weighing out the different measures of what they're to tithe and making sure that they take care of all those things, but overlooking the weightier matters of the law. Because what? They're not really interested in pleasing God. They're interested in following the law as they've interpreted it and following the traditions of their fathers and so forth. If we have instead as our objective, our principle, not that I'm going to follow all the do's and don'ts and I just have this enormous checklist before me that I'm consulting all the time, but instead my overall guiding principle is going to be, is God pleased with this or not? Yes, I'm going to consult his word and see, well, what are some of the specifics? If I'm about to make a decision that would be in contrast with his pleasure, with his will, then I should not do that. But instead, we would begin to really train ourselves to know what God is pleased with, the kind of character that he respects and regards, the kind of life that he looks on with pleasure, instead of simply always being burdened with do this, do not do this, and whatever, however many hundreds of precepts the Pharisees might have found themselves burdened under. Instead, I'm looking at what is God pleased with. If we think of this in our human relationships, maybe it becomes clearer. Your spouse, for instance, you probably want to, in your relationship with them, you want to do what is pleasing to them. You want them to be happy with your behavior, whatever that is. Whatever it is that makes them happy. It's probably different for each one of us. Well, how do you do that? When you got married, they gave you a sheet, or maybe 2 sheets, or maybe 50, or whatever it is that, I like things done this way. I like these things to eat, so only make this, honey, when you're cooking dinner. Or I like to do this, I like to go golf with the guys every Saturday, and so I have to have 10 o'clock free every weekend because that's my tea time. And you just kind of enter into this contract that you each had a team of lawyers that sat down and said, all right, you're going to have this concession given, and this concession is given on this part, and all these sorts of things. And so in your relationship with your spouse, you're just going to be following the book. You're just going to be making sure that you keep those commandments and that you don't transgress any of those things you agreed to ahead of time. That's not how it works. You have instead hopefully trained yourself to understand, well, what do they like? What is it that makes them happy? And then, because that's a more flexible idea, you can apply it to more situations without them having said specifically, I want you to do this. Maybe a situation comes up where you say, we've never talked about this before, but because I know her, because I know who this person is and what really does make her tick and what really makes her happy, she would be pleased if I do this. And then you do that for her, and lo and behold, she is pleased because you know her and you expected that outcome, and that's just the way it has gone. Because you have a relationship and because that is what's guiding you, that you want to be pleasing to her. That's much more satisfying for all parties than simply filling out the form. That's much more real, and that is much more possible. Because as we look at often, complete as they are and vital and living and active as they are and completely satisfactory and what's the word I'm looking for? They're sufficient for all things that we need to know pertaining to a godly life. The scriptures are. But they don't answer to every specific, do they? We mention that a lot of times, that there are things, that we deal with in our day and age that didn't exist in the first century. And so you don't have a specific do or don't on a particular item that might come up. But you know who God is, and you know, hopefully, what pleases him because you understand his character. So if that is the guiding principle, whatever I'm going to do, it pleases God, we can find that principle much easier to put into practice in our lives. All right, I've seen a couple hands go up. Kenny, go ahead. Yeah. 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 Who are you really trying to please? Yeah. 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 Kenny, I think, wisely brings up chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. And Paul's mentioned this idea of pleasing God several times. That was one of his chief criticisms against the Jews, for instance, back at the end of chapter 2. They're not pleasing to God. And he holds that up as something in his conduct in chapter 2, verse 4, or verses 3 and 4, that was exemplary, that they were to follow. We didn't try to please men, but to please God. That's a penetrating gaze. It's not just looking at the action. It's not just looking at whatever outward form that might take. It is going to penetrate into motive and what we're doing. What do we have in our hearts that are being weighed by God? What is actually motivating that? If it's this concern that I want to please God, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. And he's going to be pleased with that, isn't he? If we're following what he has told us to do, and it's motivated in that pure way, that is what he's looking for. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a common refrain in the prophets of what is ultimately most pleasing. Is it all those thousands of sacrifices? Is it just the strict adherence to the letter of the law? Well, it's a person's conduct, his motive, his love for God, and that is ultimately chief, I think, and has to be chief in our motivation. Now, another thing with this, and we kind of alluded to it earlier, in this pleasing God being a governing principle. If that is my goal, what I want to do more than anything else to please God, that is, Stott describes it, I like looking at it this way, as a progressive principle, meaning that it's always going up. There's always another level to that to achieve. You don't ever arrive at that and then can say, now I can stop because I did it. If I want to be pleasing to God, there's always something that I can do to do that, and there's always something I can do to do more of that. Again, looking at kind of the spousal relationship or any other relationship you have with a friend or your parents or whoever it is, that you want that relationship to be as good and strong as possible, and you want to please each other in that. Hopefully you don't ever say in your marriage, for instance, things are good enough between us. I can lay off a little bit. I don't need to be, I can quit being as nice as I've been. I can be a little meaner to them because, I can just take off the throttle for a little bit. What's the big deal? No, you're always going to be saying, this is great. I want to keep being better to them. We need to keep being better to each other. I want them to be happier and happier and happier, and that's just always kind of growing in our minds. And it's the same way with God. When we find these positive motivations behind what we're trying to do, and we'll talk about this in our lesson a little bit later from Matthew 22, when we understand that to be the greatest commandment, that we love God with all your heart and mind and soul and body, when that's what you're striving to do, and it's not a negative, instead it's a positive, it's a proactive, when can you really say, I've done that, I can stop? You can't. There's always something that has to be adding on to that. Now, that's not to make it a scary thing or some kind of obligation that we say, well, great, so I can't do that. I can't accomplish that in life. Instead, it's sort of a welcoming thing that says there's always something greater and deeper to find in your relationship with God. There is always some new depth that you can plumb in that relationship. You're not ever going to grow tired and stale in that. You would constantly be more pleasing to Him, and you would constantly be reaping greater and greater rewards from that relationship as you grow in it. So it is a progressive principle. We're striving always to please Him more and more, and so maybe that's underlying why Paul would keep saying to them, abound, increase, excel, continue on, push on, keep growing, because there's just that sense of never enough, never too much. You keep at it. Wilson? Sorry. No, you don't graduate. You keep in there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Yeah, that's really where the hard work begins, isn't it? That's really where we're actually going to have to start focusing more and more on, all right, so how do I please God? How do I walk in a way that is actually going to bring Him pleasure? And to that point, I mean, look at who he's writing to. People who were all already Christians. They'd already reached that point in their lives, and they need to continue ascending, continue walking up that hill. Yeah, Taylor. Uh-huh. Yeah. 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 Not something that comes naturally, we could say, not something that comes easily. And some of the things that he's going to call them towards, some of these specifics he begins getting into, they go against human nature at times, or they go against learned nature, I guess we might say better. The kinds of things that we tend to want to do to satisfy ourselves, to make things easy and maybe easier for ourselves at expense to someone else's difficulty, whatever it might be. But this does tie in, I think you've well pointed out, with this the idea of self-denial. We're denying self and we're honoring God. We're trying to do what's pleasing to Him, and our own wants or needs are not really under our concern. Yeah, David. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. No, absolutely. And just to reiterate that, if I didn't make that point strongly enough earlier, when we say, well, yeah, I'm trying to please God, it isn't just kind of a vague idea of, he'll probably be fine with that. I mean, it is based on knowledge. It is based on discernment and understanding. But again, I guess that's what has to be informing that idea behind, do I keep a commandment? Do I do X, Y, Z? It doesn't as much spring from what did he say specifically as it does what's pleasing to him, what draws me closer to him. Maybe that's a shade of distinction. Maybe that seems like splitting hairs at times. But that has to be the origin point, I think, that we're simply trying to please God. That motivates our decision in anything. All right, another kind of overarching principle behind this is going to be there in verse 3. And it concerns sanctification. Now, all this really beginning in verse 3 is verses 3 through 8 are kind of dealing with one particular. Verses 3 through 8 seem to be dealing all together with man's sexuality, with our sexual morality or immorality. Verses 9 through 12 are really dealing with our industry, our work, what we do in our society almost, but our commitment to working and to laboring. And then verses 13 through 18 are dealing with kind of our view of death, our view of, and maybe of bereavement, not as much our own death as those of others, the people that we're close to, but they're dealing with the final chapter of life, the end of life. So he has some practical instruction regarding all three of those realms. Many have pointed out, if you look at the key preoccupations that men have today, as well as what they would have had 2,000 years ago or at any other point in time, if you're going to talk about the topics of sex and work and death, those would have to be three pretty big ones for any society that has ever existed. Those are things that are on people's minds very, very frequently and require a lot of our attention, our understanding, our discernment. And so that's where Paul is going here in chapter 4. Those are very large key areas. I think we'll also see chapter 5, verse 14, when Paul is getting around to his sort of final exhortations, and he is exhorting the brethren there in Thessalonica, warn those who are unruly, comfort the faint-hearted, and uphold the weak. Faint-hearted might be timid there. Those three seem to be, I think you could connect those to these three different realms that he's looking at back in chapter 4. Warn those who are unruly. Those are the people that he's looking at in verses 9 through 12, the people who are no longer working, who were being lazy and had become gossips and busybodies and so forth. Warn those who are unruly. Comfort the faint-hearted or the timid, those people who are worried about the people that they have lost and don't know what their state is. Comfort them with what he's going to tell us here, of the fact that they haven't missed something by dying before the Lord came. And then uphold the weak, the people who are weak in spirit or determination. You uphold them and see that they're not losing their sanctification and their holiness by joining themselves to the practices of the world again. You uphold and strengthen them so that they can continue doing what's right. I think those all sort of draw back to what we'll find in chapter 4. But this admonition, as he is dealing with sexual immorality in verse 3, begins with another kind of overarching principle, which is sanctification. Linda mentioned this a moment ago and saw the emphasis on this that we'll find really throughout the chapter, but especially maybe in this first section here. Sanctification, being set apart, being distinct, being holy, being set apart for a purpose. Maybe we add that kind of addition to the definition. I think rightly so, that you're distinguished for a specific role or purpose. That's what sanctification or holiness entails. If you are looking at this Greek world that they inhabit, sexual immorality is rampant with them. Probably even worse than it is for us. I mean, it's not the Olympics. We're not trying to find the winner of this, whose generation was most wicked. I don't really care. They're both bad. We can say that as much. But this first century Greco-Roman pagan world that the Thessalonians are inhabiting is in a sorry state as it pertains to sexual immorality. People got married then, sure. That was something that was done. But it would be very common for a married man, to also have a mistress. And in addition to the mistress, he might have some slaves, some concubines, who would maybe be used chiefly for that purpose. It would be very common, you're walking back from the agora one day and a temple prostitute comes by, and as part of a religious observance, you go and have sex with the prostitute. And that's something that's just extremely common in all of these large sort of metropolitan, cosmopolitan Greek cities like Thessalonica. You have and all those things not really done in secret, all those things not done under cover of darkness because it's shameful. It's just openly practiced. Everyone understands that's how things go. You can't expect a man to settle down with one woman and a woman to settle down with one man, and that's just how things are going to go for all of us. You just have this overwhelming rejection of what Paul is going to set up, I think, as the guiding principle in their sanctification. So, what do we do instead? If the will of God is our sanctification, the will of God is that we would be set apart from that. He's going to move from the kind of general to the specific. So, if we are being holy and sanctified, the first step in verse 3, and you see there, verse 3, verse 4, and verse 6, they're all, I think all three of those are kind of pointing out some of the specific things that are involved in this will of God, our holiness. The first, that you abstain from sexual immorality. There's kind of the blanket coverage of this. You abhor it. Apparently that avoiding or abstaining is maybe the better translation there in the New King James. Abstain is a strong word. It's saying you don't have anything to do with it. You cut it off completely. You can't participate in it. Verse 4, and we'll talk about this maybe next week because it's kind of a lengthier explanation. something along the lines of knowing how to possess his own vessel. We'll talk next week. Is that referring to a man having his wife, or is that referring to a man being in self-control? Both would be appropriate. We'll talk about it next week. And in verse 6, thirdly, that no one would take advantage of and defraud his brother in this manner. And this is tied somehow into the admonition he's giving here. Yes, sir. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 No, very, very good point. And that's kind of the other component, I guess, that we typically understand when we're talking about holiness or sanctification. Isn't, as we mentioned, it's not just being set apart. It's not just that you're making a distinction between two things, but that it's set apart for a specific purpose. Biblically, that's almost always, if not always, understood as being it's set apart for God to do something specific and good with, and that means it can't be polluted, it can't be unclean, it can't be impure. It is meant to be the best. It is meant to be reserved for him exclusively. And so that kind of purity that we often kind of group in with holiness is totally appropriate to consider in that way, that this involves a clean break from the ways of the world in this regard. We're to be distinct from them as they were to be distinct from the world in this way. And make no mistake, today as well as then, abstaining from sexual immorality, possessing our own vessel, and not taking advantage of one another in this way is absolutely something that would distinguish us from the world, is absolutely something that would be at odds with how the world views this part of our makeup, this sexuality that each of us do possess. All right, I am going to have to stop there. I apologize. We did not move very quickly through this, but these are kind of the overarching principles that govern the rest of the text. So next week we'll start to be able to look at more of the specifics Paul has in mind. How do you live if you're pleasing to God? We'll look at that more next week in chapter 4, starting in about verse number 3. Thank you guys so much. Really do appreciate your time today.